My name is Laurie Brand, and I'm a member of the Academic Advisory Board at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. I'm pleased to welcome you to ACW's 5th annual conference and to this panel, which is entitled Strategic Challenges to U.S. Policy in the Arab World. I'm delighted to share the virtual stage this morning with 4 exceptional panelists. I'll introduce them in the order in which they will be speaking. First, Andrew Baseevich is the president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He's authored, co-authored, or edited more than a dozen books, most recent among them, America's War for the Greater Middle East, 2016, and The Age of Illusions, How America Squandered Its Cold War Victory, January of 2020. He's Professor Emeritus of International Relations and History at Boston University, and he's held fellowships at the NITSE School of Advanced International Studies, the Kennedy School of Government, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the American Academy in Berlin. Next is Maha Yahya. She's the director of the Carnegie Middle East Center. Prior to joining Carnegie, she held several senior positions at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, ESWA, and with the UN Development Program, UNDP. She's worked and consulted with multiple international and private sector organizations on projects related to socioeconomic policy analysis, development, cultural heritage, poverty reduction, housing and community development, and post-conflict reconstruction. She was the founder and editor of the MIT Electronic Journal of Middle East Studies, and she served on a number of advisory boards and is the author of numerous publications, including Unheard Voices, What Syrian Refugees Need to Return Home, at April of 2018. Third is Kristian Coates Ulrichsen. He's a Baker Institute Fellow for the Middle East at Rice University. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. His research examines the changing position of Persian Gulf states in the region, in the global order, as well as the emergence of longer-term non-military challenges to regional security. He's been published in numerous academic journals. He writes regularly for the Economist Intelligence Unit, Open Democracy, Foreign Policy, and Gulf Business News and Analysis. He's also the author of several books, most recently, Qatar and the Gulf Crisis, A Study of Resilience, this in 2019. Our 4th speaker will be Professor Amaney Jamal. She's the Sanford Professor of Politics and the Director of the Bobs Center for Peace and Justice at Princeton University. She's also the co-principal of the Arab Barometer project, and she directs the workshop on Arab political development and the Bobst American University of Beirut Collaborative Initiative. She's published and edited several books, and her articles have appeared in, among many others, the American Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Politics, and the Journal of Conflict Resolution. Her areas of specialization are the Middle East and North Africa, mass and political behavior, political development and democratization, inequality and economic segregation, Muslim immigration in the US and Europe, as well as gender, religion, and class. So I want you to all welcome these 4 panelists. Let me just, before I turn the floor over to Professor Baseevich, remind you that if you have questions, please submit them to the panel using either the Q&A function or by email to events@arabcenterdc.org. You can also join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtags ArabCenter2020 and Foreign Policy 2020. All right, without any further ado, I'll turn the panel over to Professor Baseevich. So please.
Well, thanks for the invitation to participate in this event. Thanks for the kind introduction. I guess I would begin by saying that I absolutely endorsed about 99.5% of everything that Tamara said. What you're going to hear from me is probably not much more than simply an exclamation point added to her excellent presentation. That's another way of saying that if anybody needs to take a break, now is the time to do it. Just come back in 5 minutes and you can rejoin the panel at that point. Now, where you start your story tends to determine the meaning of that story. And as an American who tends to view the Middle East very much through a provincial American lens, I tend to start the story with the promulgation of the Carter Doctrine in January of 1980. Since that time, US policy has been based on the assumption that American military power whether positioned or employed, whether the employment is direct or through proxies, but nonetheless, that American military power holds the key to advancing US strategic objectives in the region. Those objectives have been variously defined as overthrowing evildoers, promoting democracy and liberal values, enforcing the rule of law, or ensuring access to Persian Gulf oil. But the ultimate aim, in my view, the through line, has been to promote stability in the region so that this part of the world, which as a practical matter has never been of paramount strategic importance to the United States, so that this part of the world will not distract from more important priorities such as protecting the homeland and advancing US interests in Europe and East Asia. But the result has been the inverse of those intentions. The Middle East has become, for the United States, a massive strategic diversion. US military activism in the region led directly to a direct assault on the nation's political and financial capitals. And under the pretext of defeating terrorism, we have promoted it. US military interventions have actually underwritten instability, and the costs incurred by the United States have been enormous, with promises to advance democracy and human rights unfulfilled. As a direct consequence of this strategic diversion, America's standing in the world, not simply in the region, in the world, has been severely damaged. That damage, and to emphasize, that damage can only in part be assigned to the Trump administration. Today, bizarrely, in my view, the United States finds itself taking sides in regional disputes, such as Saudi Arabia versus Iran, Israel versus the Palestinians, in which the United States itself has minimal interests. As far as I can tell, the principal beneficiaries of US policy since the promulgation of the Carter Doctrine have been weapons manufacturers. So the enterprise conducted for 40 years now under the aegis of the Carter Doctrine has definitively failed. However vaguely or inconsistently, President Trump himself appears to recognize that, appears to recognize the failure of US policy in the region. But the establishment, still committed to that project, has blocked Trump's efforts to end what he calls endless wars. So what needs to be done? Well, first, acknowledge the failure. I mean, the foreign policy establishment needs to recognize and state bluntly that US policy in the region since the promulgation of the Carter Doctrine has come up short. Indeed, I think it would be appropriate to abrogate the Carter Doctrine and to end the US military presence in the Middle East. I understand that wouldn't happen overnight. It ought to happen deliberately, but it needs to happen. The United States should terminate the export of arms to the region. It should reassess its so-called special relationship with Saudi Arabia and Israel. It should attempt, and this, I know this will be difficult, but it should begin the process of repositioning the United States as an honest broker rather than as a participant in regional disputes. It should foster the creation of a new regional security architecture, perhaps similar to Europe's Organization for Security and Cooperation. Again, I recognize that it's very easy to say, be very difficult and time-consuming to achieve, but it does seem to me that in the interests of restoring stability to the region, some type of entity would be very helpful. And finally, on human rights, which American policymakers tend to talk a lot about, on human rights, the United States should lead by example, and that means that we have much work to do here at home. And with that, I'll say thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. The floor is Maha's.
Thank you, Laurie, and thank you for inviting me, Khalil, and everyone to be part of this fantastic panel. And thank you, Tammy, for a great keynote. I'm going to start where Andrew just left, Professor Baseevich, which is the need for a regional security architecture. And I couldn't agree more with you. Let's just zoom up to 30,000 feet and look at what is the region that we're looking at today. This is a region that's changed considerably in the last decade and even faster in the last 4 years. In many ways, some positive, some negative. On the one hand, you have bilateral settlements, peace settlements that leave larger questions of justice, politics, return of refugees, etc., unresolved, the whole issue of one state versus two state solutions. You also have expanding conflicts and more fragile states. Perhaps both political and economic. On the economic front, with the economic impact of COVID-19 coming on top of everything else that's been happening over the past few years, or since 2011, the decline in oil prices. We're looking at the end of the rentier states across the region. This has accelerated considerably post-COVID-19 and will have political repercussions down the road. Without opening up politically, we're likely to see more and more, if you want, unrest in parts that have not seen unrest so far. Syria will continue being a global destabilizer, regional and a global destabilizer, a source of instability, both for the region but beyond. Even though the conflict seems to have subsided, we're looking at a Syria today that is fragmented, where the central state almost, it has regained territorial control to some extent, but that territorial control is challenged on its peripheries. Turkey on the one hand, you've got the international coalition on the other, and then the whole drama around Daraa and southern Syria, where the rebels are already now re-challenging again state control over different parts. You have countries that are on the verge of becoming failed states. Lebanon is the poster child of both internal mishaps and external interventions. Which brings me actually to kind of the most salient picture that we have today in the region, which is the kind of post-Pax Americana region, where there's been a kind of Qatarization of foreign policy. Each country is an island on itself. This is nowhere is this more visible in Syria and Lebanon, where pragmatism really rules supreme. Turkey Turkey is expanding its role in Syria and Lebanon and in Libya. In some parts, it's a partner with versus the UAE and France and other parts. So you see. The states of the region have become really dominated by regional rivalries. Russia has been building up its networks. So in a sense, the Levant really is back to where it was a very long time ago, a kind of an intersection of regional international rivalries, which are coming on top of decades of governance mismanagement, clampdown on populations. You know the full story. As I was saying earlier, Lebanon perhaps is the poster child for this kind of intersection between global and international. This is a country today that is not staring into the abyss, but actually is hurtling into an economic and political abyss. And we've seen the competition between the French and American policy, where a French initiative to try and unlock a political deadlock and get a government formation in place, probably in discussion with the Iranians, has been undermined by the US coming in with its sanctions against some members here. Goes back to Tamara's point that the kind of maximum pressure campaign on Iran and on Lebanon in this case, this whole logic of destroying Lebanon to rebuild it or to save it, it just doesn't work, because once the country collapses, and it's literally on the verge of doing that, both economically and politically, it actually becomes much more difficult to rebuild it. And in chaos, I mean, nature abhors vacuums and it abhors, and in chaos, it's the militias on the ground that will be able to move in and control territory. All of this is happening at a time when there is a broader global disorder, deterioration in multilateral institutions and norms. The UN Security Council is just one example. And as I said, multilateralism is now replaced by pragmatism and regional rivalries. So that everybody is now waiting for what happens in November. Everybody's waiting with bated breath for the US elections, and the outcomes of the US elections is quite understandable. Now, while the idea that the US the region doesn't really matter to the US anymore, or it's domestic policy first, and then the pivot to Asia, and then maybe we start looking at the region. I think there is still some interest in being an honest broker, in trying to stabilize this region and trying to help create a regional security architecture and some sort of regional stabilization. The absence of the US did open the door, not only for Russian intervention, for greater Chinese interest in this region. In this case, it's more economic, for a restoration of autocratic governments across the region, but also for a plethora of also non-state actors on the ground. I mean, it's encouraged a lot of interference by countries of the region in the business of each other, which has also helped in the growth of non-state actors across the region. It's not just Iran that is encouraging this, it's everyone that's encouraging the growth of non-state actors throughout Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, wherever you look. So I think it is in the interest of the US and of global security, frankly, for the US to kind of take a second and a much harder look at where its policies are and what it is that can be done. Now, of course, a lot of it depends on whether, whether it's a Trump administration or a Biden administration. What we're expecting, and that remains to be seen, is that obviously with a Biden administration, while there might be a return to the JCPOA or a negotiation with Iran, that doesn't mean going back to the terms that were where it was left off in 2015. The likelihood of looking at regional concerns, regional issues, regional challenges become far more paramount at this stage in any kind of negotiation with Iran once more. Other issues that I think we kind of, where the United States will need to step in one way or the other, is in terms of addressing the expanding Russian influence in Syria. I mean, what Russia is not just expanding its influence, its networks, its arms deals, its investments. It's not just about in Syria. It's continuing a long-term partnership with Iran. So is China. And this has, as you all know, in the place like Syria, has helped maintain Bashar al-Assad in place. Any new administration that comes in, if there is any interest in stabilizing and in pursuing some sort of more regional peace, the issue of a political settlement in Syria becomes incredibly important. Any political settlement that is built on a let's forgive and forget, let's keep Bashar al-Assad in power is going to fail. Syria is a failed state and will remain a failed state so long as the discussions are going on in the way that they're going on at this particular moment. I'm going to stop here so that I don't take too much of my time and then wait for the Q&A and see what we can what I can expand on. Thank you, Laurie.
Thanks very much, Maha. Next is Kristian, please.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Good morning to everyone. I'm going to talk about the Gulf states and how the election may or may not affect US policy and involvement in the Gulf. And I'll begin just by talking briefly about some of the main issues that the new president, whether it's a second term President Trump or a first term President Biden, will have to focus on. One, of course, is the rift, the blockade of Qatar, the rift in the GCC. We are seeing an uptick right now in attempts to try and resolve the blockade, and I think President Trump does want to see this resolved on his watch, to then tout as another foreign policy success that the master of the art of the deal can present to his constituency ahead of the election. We are seeing, even just the last few days, meetings and exchanges of messaging between regional leaders, including directly between the Saudis and the Qataris. And so I think certainly the White House and the State Department would like to get this resolved before November. But if it isn't, and if, for example, as we've had in the past, Saudi-Qatari dialogue gets to a certain stage and then the UAE effectively says we're not ready to end this, you know, if this does move on to the in tray of the next president, I think the GCC rift will be something that will probably come to an end if Biden wins in November, just because I think the GCC rift began in 2017 because certain parties in the Gulf saw an opportunity to try and make gains by portraying a narrative that they felt would resonate in the White House, and especially in this most unconventional of US administrations, which seem to lack a settled pattern of US interests and values. And as Maha Yahya was saying, there was this pattern of interference, I think, by a lot of parties. But I think were we to return to a more conventional administration, we would certainly see potentially an end to the rift if it was not already ended before the election. The other big deal, as Tamara Witters mentioned in her keynote, is of course the normalization agreements with Israel that so far have focused on the Gulf. The UAE and then Bahrain have reached different agreements of their own with Israel. And I certainly think, again, that the Trump administration is likely to hope that more countries take part, more countries join in, again, to present itself as the deal maker that can bring people together where no other president has been able to do. I don't believe a Biden administration would be willing to roll back on any of these agreements. Certainly, the UAE in particular has made a very clever move in Washington to do this agreement to sort of almost hedge their bets. So on the one hand, they give President Trump a win that puts them in Trump administration's good books, but they also have achieved a deal with Israel that no US politician, regardless of his or her party, is likely to oppose. And they've certainly been able to regain some of the initiative, especially in relations with Congress, that perhaps was slipping away from the UAE in terms of being identified so closely with the war in Yemen, the human rights issues as well, and of course also with Saudi Arabia. The UAE and Saudi Arabia are seen as really two very close regional actors. And to some extent, making a deal with Israel without necessarily informing the Saudis until right beforehand could also be a strategic UAE move to try and differentiate the UAE from Saudi Arabia in Washington, to ensure that if and when a new administration comes in, or even if the Democrats potentially take the Senate, congressional pressure is directed against the Saudis rather than against the Emiratis. So we'll have to wait and see. For the Saudis, as I indicated just now, the problem that they do face is that there will be congressional pressure. And again, Tamara Witters was quite right to point out that this is bipartisan. This is not just on one side of the political aisle. The missteps of the last 3, 4, 5 years, if you count the invasion of Yemen in 2015, are so great that they will carry over regardless of what happens in November. Were I to be advising the Saudi government, and I'm not, but were I to be advising the Saudi government, I would suggested they would make a bold statement to try and reassure the US that they are, or that they can once again play the role of a responsible regional partner. One such move would be obviously ending the blockade of Qatar, which US officials have made it very clear they want to see ended, partly because, of course, it fractures the GCC at a time when the Trump administration is trying to escalate its pressure to contain Iran. The other move the Saudis could make would be to end the military involvement in Yemen, knowing, of course, that that would be much more of a lightning rod for the next Congress and for the next administration, potentially. So to preemptively act to move towards a political settlement or political resolution in Yemen would be a strategic move the Saudis could try to make to draw the sting from potential criticism coming their way, in much the same way the Emiratis have done with the Normalization Agreement with Israel. So we see a very stark choice in some ways. The Trump second term, if it were to happen, would likely be a continuation of the politics of transactional diplomacy that has given states in the region hope to try to push their points in DC and to make regional gains that they wouldn't have necessarily hoped to have achieved or expected to achieve under any other president. A Biden win would, of course, be returned to that much more conventional presidency. But of course, in between, we have the 2 months of the transition, which, if we're to believe some of the stories flying around this week, could well be quite contested for at least a considerable period of time. And this isn't just a comment about the Gulf, but more generally, we may also see countries around the world try to act on their own initiative to pursue national regional objectives if and when the US is tied down domestically in almost an existential sort of domestic focused issue. We could definitely see countries around the world try to take advantage of that interregnum or that vacuum of leadership. And this isn't just a statement about the Gulf, but something that we may have to keep in mind. Now, if both Joe Biden were to win the election, I think there would be some relief, I think, for the Saudis and the Emiratis especially, just because he is a more mainstream, probably the most mainstream Democrat that could have emerged from the primaries. He is not Elizabeth Warren, he is not Bernie Sanders. And so a Biden administration would not be necessarily as detrimental to or as disruptive to a US Gulf relationship as otherwise could have been the case. We may then see continuation of weapon sales, arms sales continuing, albeit with more safeguards, more conditioning. But certainly I think from a point of view of some of the Gulf partners, the alternatives could have been worse. How likely might we see policy reversals under a Biden administration were that to happen? Or again, under a Congress that were controlled fully, for example, by the Democrats? I think not necessarily policy reversals, it would be more the Biden administration would be trying to pick up the pieces that would have been bequeathed to it. For example, the resolution of the Gulf Rift, if it's not already resolved. The JCPOA, what to do about the Iran nuclear deal. Can the US, or can the Biden administration simply just go back in, sort of pretend that 2018 never really happened? But of course, this is not a simple bilateral US-Iran deal. There's a P5+1, and the Iranians would need, I think, significant reassurance and much more significant reassurance that a future US president, for example, President Cotton or President Donald Trump Jr., would not simply withdraw the US 4 years or 8 years down the line. The issue of confidence in US positioning and the value of what it means to sign an agreement and then walk away, I think is something that will take a lot longer than one administration, one term after Donald Trump to try to rebuild. So, and again, if Maha Yahya mentioned this, if there were to be a renegotiation at least of parts of the agreement, I think certainly there would be pressure on the new administration to include much more Israel, the Saudis, Emiratis, and the Gulf partners, being one of the lessons of 2015 being, of course, that the US regional partners viewed the attempt to try and isolate Iran's nuclear issue from Iran's general regional behavior as something that wasn't in their interest. And of course, we did see the Saudis and Emiratis going into Yemen in March 2015, the very same week that negotiators met in Switzerland to try and finalize the agreement. So effectively, the Yemen war began because the Saudis and Emiratis gave a vote of no confidence to the idea that one could negotiate with Iran on one issue without necessarily including all the others. And we're still living, of course, with the consequences of the war in Yemen, which has sucked the Saudis and Emiratis in much deeper than they expected and left them without a real exit clause, especially for the Saudis. So I'll just finally briefly say, well, if a Biden administration is in place, there may well be many elements of that foreign policy team who had been in place during the Obama administration as well. And so to some extent on Yemen especially, would some of the figures who might be senior in the Biden State Department or Biden National Security Council, would they have buyer's remorse, for example, about having given Saudi Arabia that blank check in 2015, even in 2016? We mustn't forget that when the war in Yemen began, we had a Democrat in the White House, and the US gave pretty much practical, logistical, political support to that campaign. Finally, the Gulf in 2021 is not the Gulf of 2015. And one would hope that at the very least, the events of the last 4 years have shown to regional actors in the Gulf the limitations of their power, and especially the attacks on oil facilities and maritime targets in 2019 and the lack of an overt US response. I think it's at least opened space for negotiations for a more balanced regional security architecture, as others have said, to begin to take shape. The Gulf states have now seen 2 successive administrations, first Obama's and now Trump's, call into question what they assumed had been a rock-solid US security guarantee, and the notion that, especially when it came to Iran, US and Gulf partner interests were one and the same. That has now been called into question. A Biden administration won't necessarily reassure Gulf partners of that equation any more than the previous 2 administrations have done. So can a Biden administration or second Trump administration find ways of working on including the regional actors to build a much more sustainable security architecture that would eventually, I suppose, be post-American in some way, just because, as others have said, China is coming in, Russia is coming in, Turkey's already there, that there will be a more balanced Gulf. No one party will take one side consistently, as the US has done over the last 40 years, vis-a-vis Iran. So with that, perhaps there might be a moment of hope, just because US policy has been interpreted in the Gulf as one of incomprehension and drift. At least it makes people realize the limitations of their power, maybe more willing to, as Obama said in 2016, which caused a lot of anger then, share the region with the other regional actors. So with that, I'll pass you back to you, Laurie.
Thanks very much, Kristian. Before I turn the floor over to Amaney Jamal, I just want to remind people that if you have questions, you can submit them through the Q&A feature, or you can email them to events@arabcenterdc.org. Okay? All right, so Amaney, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a real honor and privilege to be here. Laurie, thank you for the introduction. Maha, Kristian, and Andrew, it's really a pleasure joining you. And I really want to thank the Arab Center, Khalil, Lena, and team for having us here. I also want to apologize to Tammy for coming in late. I was teaching this morning, but I will look for your talk, and I look forward to hearing it. So today I'm going to share my screen, and I hope you can all see it. Thumbs up. Very good. So I'm talking about rights and freedoms during the Trump presidency, trying to look at whether we can sort of identify patterns of support for democratic and basic rights in the region as they sort of line up with the Trump presidency. And for today's talk, I'll be relying on the Arab Barometer project just to really brief sort of overview of the Arab Barometer project. To date, we've surveyed over 70,000 individuals in the region. We've conducted 5 waves. We're beginning to field the 6th wave. And we're basically in a number of countries, depending on events in the region and whether we can safely and soundly sample in those countries. But for today's findings, I'm relying on the wave 5 of the Arab Barometer data, which was conducted back in 2018, 2019. And some of the key findings for today's talk is the first point is Trump, probably no surprise, is deeply unpopular across the region compared to other leaders. Perceptions of the degree to which basic freedoms are guaranteed have declined since 2016, or the incoming of the Trump administration. Support for democracy remains high, but most Arabs link democracy to economic justice. And if we're concerned about the political instability in the region, leading to harsher economic realities, this doesn't bode well for overall support for democracy. And Arab citizens who support Trump are often more suspicious of democracy and less concerned about violations of their civil rights. So again, this idea that democratic and civil political liberties are second-order priorities for perhaps Trump supporters in this country and abroad. We see that continuation, or if you may, I might even say this dissemination or broadcasting of the hazards, if you may, of democracy and liberties. So views of Trump and other leaders, what we see is that, as I've said, is Trump is very unpopular in the Middle East. In fact, Putin is more popular than Trump across almost every single country. But Erdogan of Turkey is more popular than both leaders combined. So again, a good sort of analytical question here would be whether the Trump presidency and the ascendance of both Trump and sort of Putin in the region, has it sort of pushed the pendulum towards support for quote unquote what might be perceived as a more domestic leader, a Middle Eastern leader like Erdogan. Furthermore, when we think about economic relations or support for economic relations with the US, what we see is that by and large, support is never reaching more than 50% among the populations of the Middle East for strong relations with the US. And what we see is that except for Sudan and Jordan, but since 2016, we're beginning to see declines in some of the countries in terms of wanting stronger economic ties with the US. We see this especially in a country like Tunisia, which is often applauded as our democratic poster child. But also even in Jordan has remained constant. But you see that for the MENA average, which is this one, we see a slight decline as well. But relating this point to a point that Maha raised in her talk, what we're seeing is that there's greater support for wanting stronger economic ties with Russia among the populations, and especially China. And this idea that there might be a counterbalance to the US economically in the region, at least some citizens are looking towards these two options, which are again authoritarian countries penetrating the region economically. So when we look at political freedoms, what we see is that by and large, in only 2 or 3 countries in 2018, 2019, did populations say that they felt that the freedom of speech was guaranteed to a great or medium extent. This was in Tunisia, Kuwait, and Jordan. No majority in the rest of the Arab world thought that that was the case. And what's really telling is this, this graph here is that since 2016, the percent who say that the right of freedom of speech is guaranteed has almost plummeted systematically across the region. Here's the MENA trend line. You see almost a 20% drop, which again, this idea that basic freedoms are to the extent that they were guaranteed in the Arab world to begin with, that since 2016, there's a big drop in the perception that they'll be guaranteed, almost as if regimes have sanctioned to remove these rights, and citizens are very aware of this. Furthermore, what we see that if we even break down the data further, among Trump supporters, the small percentage of Trump supporters, they are more likely to say that freedom of speech is already enjoyed enough across. And we see this in Egypt, in Palestine, in Libya, and Sudan, for example. When we look at freedom to demonstrate, the percent who say this right is guaranteed to a great or medium extent, again, no majority in any of the Arab countries believe that this right is guaranteed. But again, since 2016, across the board, the percentage of people who believe that this is guaranteed, this right is guaranteed, has also declined. Here's the MENA trend line. It's from 50% to 35%, almost a 15-point decrease. Well, actually a 15-point decrease. And then I can say more about the Trump supporters, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on some of the other trends. The right of freedom of association. The percent who say this right is guaranteed to a great or medium extent? We have slight majorities in Tunisia, Yemen, Morocco, Kuwait, who are saying that this right is guaranteed. Slight minority, less than the majority who say it's guaranteed in most of the states, right? So this is not a bad finding, but again, since the Trump presidency, we see these massive declines across the region. About 20% for the MENA trend line, or about 16% from 64 to 48% across the region in the last 4 years, or at least when this data was collected 3-4 years ago. Finally, when we look at views on democracy, so the percentage of people that when we ask people, do you believe that democracy is bad for the economy? What we find is in Iraq, the majority of people believe, yes, democracy is bad for the economy. There's no surprise there. Democracy is associated with a lot of civic conflict in the region. Across the rest of the region, only about a third of the population in most countries believe that's the case. However, since 2016, a larger majority is gradually beginning to sort of subscribe to this view that democracy is bad for the economy. We especially see it in Iraq. If we look at the MENA trend line, we see it sort of increasing as well. If you look at Algeria, this perception holds as well. So this is a slight indication that people might be linking democracy to more political instability given the situation in the Middle East. We especially see this when we get to the instability slide. And again, in countries like Iraq, the percentage of people that say that democracy is linked to instability is high. 52% of Iraqis believe it, but 42% of Tunisians, again, Tunisia is often applauded as our democratic poster child. They are also sort of doubting the merits of democracy given Tunisia is still withstanding conflict when we compare it to other Arab countries, but nevertheless, it does raise concern. We look at the MENA trend line across time, and about a third of MENA since 2016 believes that democracy leads to instability. Furthermore, when we think about support for democracy as the best system of government, although the majority of citizens across the region, except for Yemen, and still it's a slight majority there, believe that support for democracy is the best system of governance. We see that we're seeing some declines in this indicator, especially, for example, in Tunisia. 85% thought it was the best form of governance in 2016. Now that's only 79%. We see that in 2016, 80% of MENAs felt that democracy was the best form of government. Today, that percentage is at 72%. We see this in Algeria. So this is something that we're keeping our eye on. And what will be really curious if indeed we see a Biden administration come into power, what will happen to these perceptions? Or if Trump stays in power, will we see these perceptions continue to sort of fall? Finally, I do want to just spend a moment on this slide. I want to also sort of break down how people in the region think about democracy. Oftentimes, we think of democracy in procedural terms or in political terms, in terms of support for certain political rights, but the vast majority of individuals in MENA link job creation, jobs for all, and government provides security. This old school idea of order and stability, that these two factors constitute 66% of support for democracy. We need state stability, and we need the basic fundamentals of a sound economy for job creation. And this is really important for how people in the region see democracy moving forward. And if these two things are consistently shattered by ongoing instability and ongoing escapades of some leaders across the Middle East, where the stability of these countries, where the ability of these countries to provide security and jobs for their citizens is constantly being challenged, it will have consequences on how citizens view democracy and view the whole idea and program of civic and political liberties in the region as being useful or harmful towards their everyday lives, their everyday livelihoods, and their everyday safety. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Amaney. Thanks to all of you for what's been a great panel so far. We have a number of questions that have already come in. In some cases, they're addressed to a particular person, so I'll direct it to that panelist first. But if others want to weigh in, please just unmute and answer as well after the first person responds. So the first question I have here is for Andrew Baseevich. How would a future U.S. policy position how would future U.S. policy position the U.S. as a neutral broker in the Middle East? Is there historic precedent for this, and is it realistic?
Well, that's a good question. Historical precedent for the United States acting as a honest broker or neutral party. Well, certainly the analogy is imperfect, but perhaps in that period, right toward the end of when the Cold War ended, where the George Herbert Walker Bush administration played a very enlightened role, I think, in conducting negotiations that involved the then still existing Soviet Union and the recently reunited Federal Republic of Germany in a way that wedded Germany to Europe, meaning keeping Germany within NATO, and at the same time satisfied Mikhail Gorbachev that the security interests of the Soviet Union would be respected. I think that was a brilliant effort on his part. Subsequently, I think we blew it when we undertook this needless expansion of NATO to the east, which is one of the contributing factors to the antagonistic relationship with post-Soviet Russia, but that's a somewhat different story. How would one do that? Well, let's face it, it would be a very complicated and difficult. How would you do it in the Middle East? It would be a complicated and difficult and time-consuming undertaking that would require great patience, no doubt, over the course of multiple administrations. So not for a second am I suggesting that we sort of wave a magic wand. There would be a need to rebuild over time a sense of trust among with parties where, particularly since Trump became president, we've squandered whatever trust we had developed. But I think the one-word answer is diplomacy. To move away from this reckless and counterproductive reliance on military power, and in doing so, demonstrate that the United States is in fact serious about engaging in diplomacy as the preferred way to try to bring about the resolution of conflicts. That's a very broad and general answer, and I apologize for that, but it seems to me that's the essence of the matter.
Let me turn to a question for Maha. And the question is, there's been several suggestions recently that partition might be the most rational and effective solution to the collapse of governance in Lebanon. Is this proposal getting any traction in Lebanon, and would partition present another challenge to US objectives in the region?
Thank you, Laurie. Yes, there has been increasing discussion of this, but there is a kind of slippage between talking about partition, talking about federalism, talking about expanded decentralization in the country. The point is, this country is very tiny. It's only, I mean, all in all, the square meters of Lebanon is 10,400 and, you know, something, 52 square meters. It's a tiny country. What is it that I think smaller than the state of New York? So what are you going to partition? You know, how are you going to partition something this small? Let's start with the geography. And then when you talk about demography, the different regions, even though you may have regions that have a specific communal sectarian color, if you want to do it on the basis of sect and ethnicity, most regions are mixed to some extent. There is some mixed. So what do you do? Mass population displacement? Bottom line is, I think it's these kinds of debates and discussions are very much part and parcel of, they reflect the kind of fears, identity-based fears, but also that are becoming more pervasive in the discussions. The concern that Hezbollah's connection to a regional power, to Iran, is taking the country on a ride and actually has placed Lebanon in the eye of the storm, in the eye of, I mean, until now there has been some sort of a firewall, but now we're smack in the eye of the storm of the region, part of this tug of war and between the US and Iran. So the sense is, okay, let's just leave them be. They can, you know, rule over their areas and we can do our own thing. It doesn't work, unfortunately. I think the more serious discussion today is in terms of the governance of the country and not in terms of actual partition or federation. The issue, sorry, one last thing on this issue of partition is that if you start going down that road, you start talking about partition in Syria, you start talking about a completely new region. We're talking about a rethinking of the whole region. So we're back to the end of World War I, and let's rethink the boundaries of all the region and, you know, what is Lebanon and what is Syria, or maybe we'll come up with new names for these new countries. I think that's a bit kind of far-fetched, where it's something totally different. I think what is more realistic when it comes to Lebanon is talk about implementing actually, you know, a more broader decentralization, giving people more say in the governance, at regional affairs. And this is already written into the political settlement, the Ta'if agreement. It talked about broader decentralization at the regional level, giving municipalities more say in how they identify their needs. There are issues at the local level that can be done to address some of those needs without going as far, you know, as discussing partition. I don't think this will, this is something that the US should encourage or would need to deal with as such as a policy option for all the reasons that I just mentioned. Just on the US policy, I think what the next president will have to contend with. What's very clear to me now is that this maximum campaign pressure is intensifying right now via sanctions and other means on Iran, and Lebanon is part and parcel of that maximum campaign pressure. Given the significant economic crisis the country is in and political crisis, just to give a few figures, the currency has lost close to 80% of its value since October. More than 50% of the population is below the poverty line. Hundreds of thousands have lost their jobs. The Beirut explosion literally was catastrophic. It damaged more than half the city. 300,000 people are unemployed. So the middle class is just disappearing. Just to give again another small illustration, an assistant professor at the American University in Beirut used to make the equivalent of $66,000 a year in Lebanese lira. That amount is now shrunk to close to $11,000, $12,000 a year. Just to give a sense of the kind of decline we're looking at in the quality of life for ordinary people, for the professionals. The cost of living is skyrocketing. We're in hyperinflation territory. So the maximum campaign pressure on the country is actually, and this idea that I mentioned earlier that we have to destroy Lebanon to save it, is completely erroneous. If this country is destroyed, and it is with this, it's hurtling in that direction, it's going to be very difficult to rebuild. And you have one more failed state in the region, a country that hosts 1 million refugees, 1 million Syrian refugees. We're seeing increasingly more and more people, refugees and Lebanese, trying to make it out of Lebanon on boats. It gets smuggled. There's been a story in the press recently of a boat that was capsized very close to Cyprus, and people were returned, and many, unfortunately, were lost at sea. So the situation is dire. What I would push for, my concern now is this maximum pressure campaign is increasing until the election. The idea is that the idea from the Trump administration is to make sure that if a new administration comes into place, it's very difficult for them to roll back. A lot of the damage would have already been done. Yes, a lot of the damage will have already been done. It'll be left to the new administration to try and pick up the pieces. I don't think there's the stamina to pick up the pieces, whether in Lebanon, in Syria, or elsewhere today. And meanwhile, it's really opened the country to a lot of regional competition. The Emiratis are beginning to get active here. The Turkey is becoming more visibly active here. In addition to the Russians, the Chinese, it's amazing. I mean, this is a tiny country now. Everyone is interested, far more interested visibly in trying to shape where things go next.
Thanks very much, Maha.
It was a long answer to a short question.
No, it's excellent. Thank you so much. Let's move to a question for Kristian. And so this is from Katie Gallagher. Could you elaborate on your view that the GCC rift would dissolve if candidate Biden became president? How do you see this rift ending if there is such a stalemate over the list of demands? It seems that the administration has been, at least somewhat publicly, uninterested in the blockade and the Saudi list of demands.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I think one of the reasons it's been stuck for so long is that the administration wants to see a resolution of the issues, not necessarily the issues that were presented by the Saudis and Emiratis in their 13 demands of 2017. But the main issues, like, for example, restrictions on Qatari airspace, which means that Qatari airliners need to use Iranian airspace, which then contributes to Iranian financial coffers as well. So there's been issues of border closures, issues of airspace restrictions, the splitting up of families and communities. And so those are the specific issues which I think the Trump administration is trying to resolve one by one. And also to facilitate dialogue bilaterally between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, because from all intents and purposes, the blockade is effectively Saudi closing the land border with Qatar, so only land border, and it's also the restrictions on airspace. So were they to be lifted by a bilateral Saudi-Qatari agreement, the rift would almost be ended in terms of blockade. The problem is this isn't a bilateral Saudi-Qatari issue. There were 4 blockading states, and the UAE, and especially Abu Dhabi and Mohammed bin Zayed, are, I think, the driving force behind the blockade. And so we've seen several times in the past, in December 2019, and again in July 2020, when US officials felt that they were close to a resolution, at least on lifting Saudi restrictions on airspace. On both occasions, the deal never got struck, in part because the UAE, I think, went in and said, we don't support this deal, and the Saudis don't seem to want, at this point at least, to go against the UAE on this issue. I think from a Saudi point of view, they realized perhaps that there were bigger issues potentially down the line with the UAE, especially over Yemen, as Yemen becomes closer to a political settlement. Saudis and the Emiratis have been supporting quite different groups. And so, in a sense, why risk political capital over Qatar when you might need to use it over Yemen down the line? I think that's always, so we've already cross purposes. The Saudis, so the US wanting a sort of Saudi-Qatari bilateral dialogue, but then 4 blockading states having to agree amongst themselves before it can be resolved. So I think that's where we're stuck. It may well be that the Saudis do face pressure from the US on the one side to resolve the issues, pressure from MBZ on the other side not to give in and to make a deal. And so the question then for Mohammed bin Salman and for the king potentially is, which way do they jump? Do they take the view that it's better to give the Trump administration or an incoming Biden administration a reassurance of the fact that Saudi Arabia can now move on, has learned its lessons maybe for the last 4 years, is no longer interested in regional adventurism to the same extent it was? Or will they still take the view that the Saudi-Emirati alignment is still more important than anything else in terms of regional policy? And I can't answer that question, but I think that's what it comes down to. Will MBS choose to accede to US pressure, or will the Emirati alignment be too great for that to happen? And which way he jumps, which way he chooses, will, of course, I think, determine whether or not this issue gets resolved anytime soon.
Thank you, Kristian. Amaney, some questions about the potential Trump effect. Are you suggesting that with the arrival of Trump to power, there's been a decline in the importance of freedoms? Are you attributing this to the fact that Trump in power is the reason for this decline in the support for or belief in freedoms? Or are you saying there's a correlation between Trump in power and decline in support for those freedoms? And depending on what your answer is, how do you explain that?
So thank you so much for the question. So yes, we are positing that there's a direct correlation between the Trump presidency and the decline in support or belief that these political liberties are either important or guaranteed in Arab societies. And the link between that correlation, the way we see it, is either direct or indirect. The direct mechanism would be the following, which is that if you look at the level of quote unquote US scrutiny of political rights violations, and look at, like, you know, I know we're talking about whether or not the US has been a credible force of democratic promotion, whether the US has been an honest broker. We can talk all about that. But there was this moment in time, and we can sort of break this down, that, you know, when there were these overwhelming violations of human rights, every now and then we did hear objections from different corners of the US administration. Under Trump, we don't hear those objections anymore. And in a sense, this could possibly embolden authoritarian leaders in the region to simply not care, or at least be a little bit more careless about these rights. So that's the first sort of direct link. And in fact, you know, Donald Trump or the Trump administration has embraced countries that have moved towards more horrendous records on their human rights. That's the first direct mechanism. But there's also an indirect mechanism, which is, we capture this in our public opinion surveys, but also our qualitative work with ordinary citizens in the region, which is this idea that, you know, the governments in their regions will care about these civil liberties or political liberties, whether it's the freedom of speech or freedom of press, freedom of association, because there's an international order that sort of mandates this from some of the states, especially Arab states, especially donor recipient Arab states. And that at some point, at least among the citizens, there's just an idea that there's only so much regimes can get away with if they're talking about withdrawing or disregarding political and civil liberties in the region. And with this idea of Trump coming to power and broadcasting to the world, not only in the US, but to the world, that this is a leader who is not necessarily committed to some of the core democratic freedoms and principles, either in the US or elsewhere, it does leave citizens, not only in the Middle East, but across the globe, a little bit unsettled about the guarantee of these freedoms in their own societies. And whether the U.S. likes it or not, whether or not the U.S. claims to be isolationist or not, given that for the last 50 years, the U.S. has tried to portray itself as a country, you know, and I'm not naive or being Pollyannish here, but nevertheless has tried to sort of engage in this democracy promotion industry. And everybody understands that there's a set of politics behind this. There's always at least this idea that there are some certain red lines that can't be crossed when it comes to these newfound civil liberties in some countries, or at least if they're crossed, you're going to hear objections in Congress, you're going to hear objections in the US administration, and now we don't hear them, at least not in the administration. So this probably leaves citizens across the globe, especially those living in countries that are less democratic, a little bit unsettled about those the guarantee of those rights and liberties. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Amaney. We'll go back to Andrew for the next question, which relates to arms sales. And this questioner asks, are arms sales a necessary and permanent feature of the U.S. pursuit of its own national interests in the Middle East? Doesn't that negate another U.S. interest of seeking the peaceful resolution to regional conflicts?
Yes. I mean, it does seem to me to be a permanent feature. You know, if we go back to the, let me revise that. If the biggest recipients of American arms today are, I may be a little bit off here, but Israel, it's like $3.5 billion a year. Egypt, I'm not sure what the number is. It's probably somewhere between $1 and $2 billion, plus Saudi Arabia, which buys a lot. Wasn't always that way. During the Eisenhower administration, the position of the United States was that pouring weapons into the region would likely to encourage conflict. And the Eisenhower administration thought that imposing restrictions on arms sales would help to avert conflict. I think in my telling of the tale, that begins to change with the Kennedy administration, which opens the door to providing arms to Israel, first on a basis of cash sales, but over time, particularly when we get to the Nixon administration, it becomes grants. Of course, there's the relationship between the United States and Iran back in the days of the Shah, where this is at the end of the Vietnam War. The Nixon, so-called Nixon doctrine, imagined that having a well-armed ally in Iran would serve as a proxy advancing U.S. interests. None of these have turned out very well from the point of U.S. interests, or frankly, the well-being of the people in the region, at least in my estimate. Today, I do believe that a large explanation for why this counterproductive policy continues is because it serves the interests of the military-industrial complex, which is another way of saying that it serves the interests of powerful domestic actors, both the corporations that build and sell these arms, but also, of course, members of Congress who depend on campaign contributions and the like to stay in office. So it's a real witch's brew, I think, and I think if we just keep doing it, we're going to keep sowing the seeds for more conflicts.
Okay, thank you very much. Maha, a question which asks you gave such an incredible sort of summary and beyond summary of events in Lebanon and problems in Lebanon before, but this question asks for a little bit more in the way of specifics about the Trump administration and also the French involvement. How far can the Trump administration go in pushing Hezbollah with sanctions? Mustafa Adib appears close to forming a new government that will likely be approved by the French. Can the Trump administration afford to abort the new government's work? Or would you expect that?
Unfortunately, actually, Mustafa Adib is on his way now to see the President Michel Aoun, and it looks likely that he's going to actually, at least that's what we're hearing, it's likely that he will apologize and will not be forming a government. If that happens, then we're really looking at a very bad situation. It means that the French initiative for now has fallen through. Whatever effort was being put by the French in backdoor negotiations between the Americans and the Iranians has also fallen through. This means there's not going to be any funding coming to Lebanon. Negotiations with the IMF continue to be stalled because right now we're in a caretaker government situation. So the situation's quite dire and quite bad. The expectation then, if that happens, is the economy is going to deteriorate even more quickly at a much more exponential pace. Probably the lira will lose more of its value. Today it's between 7,700 liras. It can go up very quickly. We may see more and more security incidents on the ground. Let's not forget that the economic decline in Lebanon, the collapse of the economy, is affecting the security sector as well. And we're already seeing signs of this across the country. So yes, unfortunately, if it is true that Mustafa Adib, the Prime Minister designate, is on his way to apologize for forming the government, we're looking at a very turbulent period for Lebanon in the coming few weeks and days. And months. In terms of can the Trump, should he form a government? I mean, the question is now moot. Initially, the hope was that there was a French, I think the promise was that there was a French-US agreement to kind of firewall Lebanon a little bit, move forward with a cabinet of independents, mainly people who really know what they're doing. It would be a small cabinet. That would be mandated specifically to address the economic crisis and stabilize Lebanon as everybody waits for the outcome of the U.S. elections. This is kind of the milestone. It's interesting to me that from the perspective of the region where I am right now, people's understanding of what's going on in the U.S. is really in the sense that there is going to be an election in November, and we will know the results immediately. Now, we haven't talked about this, but the chances of a close call in the US, not knowing the results immediately, whether President Trump will concede if Biden wins, and then the sense that really any policy in the region is 3 or 4 on the priority list of any administration. It will take them at least 6 months to kind of get in place. You all know this. These are not things that are entering into the calculus here. So the idea that, okay, once we know things, things are going in a different direction is just completely unrealistic. So for Lebanon in particular, this really is a disaster because the country cannot withstand will not be on its feet in 6 months' time. They'll be removing subsidies on fuel, on medicine, and on wheat in the coming few weeks. There's no money left. People's money is stuck in banks. We can't access our money in banks. They've seen, life savings, pensions, everything's gone. So the country cannot withstand that kind of pressure. What I would actually now push for is, if that is the case, is I think there needs to be, at least for Lebanon, again, I've been making this for a long time, Lebanon needs to be considered a regional public good. This is a place where you really, despite everything, you have 18 recognized religious sects. It's a microcosm of what's happening around the world, kind of the different tug of war that's happening in it. But also it's a cosmopolitan society. It's one where it's I don't want to say resilient because I've developed a very strong allergy to this word, Lebanon. But it's really a place where we saw this in the aftermath of the explosion. The state was absent, but people were present. People were helping each other. Everything that's happened until now has been people to people, support from the diaspora. It has a remarkable society. So if I'm going to make a case for my country, it's please firewall it a little bit. It needs some stability. And I think perhaps an emergency fund that is overseen by the international community with people in Lebanon. You have some fantastic heads of syndicates. There are great organizations. There are institutions in the country that work and that can be involved in stabilizing the system. It's not all about the political leadership that is bottlenecking, and it's not all about Hezbollah. You know, you're missing the forest for the trees if the whole focus is just on Hezbollah. Lebanon is not just Hezbollah. I'm sorry, it's a lot more than this. So I'll stop here.
Thanks so much. Moving on to a question for Kristian, and here I think I'm going to try and combine a couple of questions. One from Greg Aftandalian, who's a non-resident fellow at the Arab Center, and he asks, if Biden gets elected and rejoins the JCPOA, perhaps with some caveats, how will that affect US relations with Saudi Arabia and the UAE? And then there's another question which sort of intersects with that, which is, will there be a Bernie Sanders effect in a Biden administration, especially with regard to US weapons sales and relations with Gulf countries, given the war in Yemen and also the Khashoggi killing?
Well, thank you for combining those two excellent questions. I mean, there will certainly be pressure on a Biden administration from Democrats in Congress, and also I think from grassroots and popular pressure as well, not to repeat the mistakes or at least the practices of past administrations by giving effectively a blank check to Saudi Arabia especially. And I think that speaks to the wider issue that the Saudi-US relationship has become dangerously politicized. The Saudis have become so closely associated with Trump administration, the Trump White House over the past 4 years, and of course Mohammed bin Salman with individual members such as Jared Kushner, that the Biden administration and a wider Democrat Congress will take office with deep suspicion, and there will certainly be pressure, I think, on a Biden White House, if there were to be one, not to simply repeat the Obama policy of 2015, which is to accept the Saudis at their word in Yemen, to facilitate and support Saudi actions. And so whether or not that, I mean, I think that's very likely that there will be many more caveats and conditions placed on US support for Saudi policymaking if and when we have a Democrat in the White House. In terms of the JCPOA and rejoining or under whatever conditions, it would certainly be potentially resisted by Saudi, perhaps less so by the UAE. I say less so now because the experience of the past 15 months since the beginnings of the attacks on Gulf energy maritime targets in May and June 2019, of course, the attack on Saudi oil facilities last September, really had a sobering effect, I think, on the Saudis and Emiratis. They realize, I think, now to an extent that they didn't in the past, that they have to stand on their own 2 feet. And you kind of essentially have to cut your cloth according to what you have. And it's not axiomatic that the US will be ready and willing to take action to defend Saudi or the UAE, were they to overstep the mark and to provoke Iran into any sort of retaliatory action. For example, in January 2020, after the killing of Qasem Soleimani, the Saudi Deputy Defense Minister, Khalid bin Salman, the brother of MBS, he actually went to Washington to effectively call for de-escalation. Now, this was very different from his brother, Mohammed bin Salman's commentary in 2017, 2018, when, for example, he was vowing that Saudi Arabia would get a nuclear bomb if they felt Iran was moving in that direction, and that the Saudis would ensure that were there to be any conflict with Iran, it would be felt in Iran, not in Saudi Arabia. So we've seen already quite a significant shift, born, I think, out of the limitations, the kind of recognition of the limitations of Saudi and Emirati power. So it may well be that they will have no option but to acknowledge that a US rejoining a JCPOA or JCPOA 2.0 is something that they can no longer necessarily bypass. And of course, the way they bypassed that in 2015 was going into Yemen. I just don't think that option is there now, just because Yemen has worked out so badly in terms of outcomes that I don't think that policy option is no longer on the table. If they thought it was in 2015, and clearly they did, but they've learned the hard way. I think they learned the hard way of that limitation. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much, Kristian. One last question, Amaney, sort of pushing you a little bit more on this relationship between sort of the Trump administration and issues related to democracy. I'll sort of summarize this question in saying, given this administration's approach and given what we see in terms of democracy, the perception of democracy in the region, what does that mean for, if there are any ongoing or any future efforts by the US to support or promote democracy in the region?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you for that. So my thinking is that, with the rhetoric, at least the lack of democratic rhetoric and the lack of democratic sort of credibility, I think that's really going to hurt. There's going to be like this long-term effect on, I think the U.S. already struggled as being seen as an honest, quote unquote, democratic broker. I certainly think what's happened since Trump has come to office has played a more negative role in terms of affecting that perception. And I think it's going to hurt. I think, and so the question is, does Biden come in, if Biden comes into power, does he come in to try to restore that image? My concern on this and a host of questions have been raised by the audience, whether it's on democracy promotion, maybe trying to stabilize and help Lebanon, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, this issue of Jerusalem, is that if Biden comes into power, he's going to be so bogged down in the pandemic and trying to save the U.S. economically right now, because as things are not looking very well. That all of these issues internationally, especially in the Middle East, are going to be probably put on hold. So it's going to either mean that other countries are going to step up to fill the vacuum. So we might see Russia and China playing a bigger role in the region. It also might mean that a lot of the countries who have been emboldened under the Trump years will continue to feel the emboldening effects of this. I don't see any significant progress being made on the issue of Palestine, Israel, or Jerusalem. Biden has already said that he's not going to move the embassy, that they might open up the consulate in East Jerusalem to continue engaging the Palestinians. But the fact that, nobody's talking about the fact that, fewer and fewer and fewer Palestinians can actually even access East Jerusalem. And that's especially true under the Trump, through the last 4 years. So to think that the Trump effect in the region is going to be reversed automatically by a Biden victory, as political scientists, we talk about critical junctures and path-dependent effects. I think we're on a different path now, we're going, and I hope policymakers and diplomats will sort of try to grapple with the fact and the realization that we are on a different track than we were on, and reversing history is very difficult, but the adjustments have to be made to not where we were under Obama or previous administrations, even other administrations, but the adjustments have to be done with taking into account where we are with the damage that has already been done on all these fronts. And that's a different diplomatic mission, different sort of strategic mission. And so I'll sort of leave you with that, if I may.
Okay, thanks very much, Amaney. I'm going to now take one question and sort of open it up to all of you or any of you who might like to respond. The questioner, who's Deborah Trent, says that all of you have, in one way or another, discussed the need for dialogue to share perspectives or repair U.S. relations in the region. That is, in broad terms, the work of diplomacy. And Kristian in particular referred to the Trump administration's transactional diplomacy. So would any of you like to address how, in the case of either Trump or Biden's winning in November, a more relational or even transformational diplomatic approach could be promoted? We have so much evidence of the need for multi-stakeholder, cross-sectoral consensus building to address corruption, lack of trust in U.S. government, stability, economic opportunity, and so on. So would anyone like to take on all of that or parts of that? I'll just go in the order in which we've been proceeding. Andrew, would you like to respond to that?
Probably not. I'm reflecting on Amaney's last set of remarks, and I think she's really touching on a crucial point. Maybe I take the rhetoric of politicians too seriously, but when Biden made his acceptance speech at the Democratic National Convention, the big promise, the big commitment was to save the soul of America. That was the phrase that he used. I think he used that phrase on multiple occasions. And that says that his focus is going to be on repairing the nation, which is damaged by the events of the present year, like the pandemic and the economic collapse, that is in the midst of this reckoning with the legacy of racism, which at least in the eyes of some Americans, not all Americans, has been so damaged by the coarseness and dishonesty of the Trump administration, all of which says is that the repair job is a monumental one. And Biden is saying, elect me and I will undertake that repair job. And in that sense, I agree with the comments that the amount of available energy that's going to be available for trying to sort out these very difficult problems in the Middle East, I think is going to be minimal. Furthermore, to the extent that a Biden foreign policy agenda will form, there'll have to be some kind of a foreign policy agenda. My guess is that it would prioritize two items, not unrelated to the Middle East, but not directly related. And the first one is the rise of China. And this, my sense is in the foreign policy community, this growing perception that a Cold War with China is all but inevitable. That's not my view. I think a Cold War with China would be disastrous. But nonetheless, to the extent that foreign policy gets attention, it's going to be China that's going to get attention. Not Lebanon, not Saudi Arabia. I'm not trying to say this is good or bad. It just seems to me that that's what it's going to be. And then the second foreign policy item, if you want to call it that, is because it's global policy, is climate change, which more and more and more is gaining recognition as something that is a potentially existential threat. And the fires on the West Coast, the hurricanes on the Gulf Coast, the number of people that are displaced, I mean, I don't need to recite all that. But all of that together, it seems to me, is unlikely to leave a heck of a lot of bandwidth that is going to attend to the problems that we have been discussing. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just saying it seems to me that the correlation of factors that are lining up are likely to lead to that sort of an outcome.
Maha, would you, do you want to take up any part of that, or any of the other thing, since Andrew also was building on what Amaney had to say, please go ahead.
Thank you, Laurie. I concur with both Manny and Andrew. The dramatic changes. I mean, we are on a different path today, and the attention span of a new president is simply not going to be here. This region is not in its order of priorities. The problem is, I mean, that's kind of where I'm thinking that perhaps the strategic interest partnership with Israel, the investment in Israeli security, may in fact lead the attention back here. Because a volatile region, one in which Lebanon has collapsed, one in which Russia is gaining, well, Russia doesn't threaten Israel, it's a different story, but one in which the Russian, Chinese, and China are coming in to fill the gap, where Turkey is feeling that it can play, you know, insert itself and move into literally voids, political voids and power voids on the ground. And it's certainly trying to position itself. And we haven't talked about the conflict, not the conflict, but the tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean over resources, natural resources and gas. So the potential for this region to assert itself as a foreign policy item on the agenda of any new president, whoever, you know, whether it's Trump or it's Biden, I wouldn't put it that far down the road. And I think that administration will need to be ready, and need to be ready with coming in, with acknowledging the path that we're currently on and looking at ways to deal with it. First and foremost is, yes, addressing some of the double standards in the rhetoric, looking at concrete policies, whether it's vis-a-vis the Palestinian issue, contingent annexation, whether it's vis-a-vis, I don't know, human rights records. What's happening in Egypt, for example, is just astonishing, and yet the world is falling silent. So I think the region is going to assert itself and force some attention on itself, because the way things are going, it's just going to get more and more fragmented, with more and more instability that will have a regional as well as a global impact. What happens in this region does not stay in this region, unfortunately. And we're looking at a very, very unstable, I mean, Tamara referenced the massive population shifts, the economic downturns, etc.
Okay. So, Kristian, would you like to respond?
Yeah, thank you. The question was also about the relational aspects and how to rebuild trust. And of course, that won't be overnight. It will be, I think, probably longer than one presidential term as well. I think one issue which has to be addressed and will be addressed with the Biden administration would be that relations have to be conducted on an institutional level, not on a personal level. And I think that's the root of a lot of the problems we've seen over the past 4 years, when we've had leaders in the Gulf, in Egypt, elsewhere, thinking that this is a chance for them to put a case to the White House, to put a case to the president and the people around him, to almost take their chance. For example, the Riyadh Summit, President Trump's first overseas visit as president in May 2017, was effectively organized by the White House together with the Royal Court. State Department was almost cut out of the organization, offering to send briefing notes, offering to send position papers, and not being taken up. And we all know what happened in Riyadh, because President Trump then alluded to conversations he'd had with Riyadh, in Riyadh, when he announced his support for the move against Qatar in June 2017. Another example would be when Trump suddenly suggested banning the Muslim Brotherhood, and it turned out he had been speaking to President Sisi of Egypt a couple of days before that. So this is the notion that kind of a White House that almost is a carbon copy of the sort of royal court of especially the Gulf states. The notion that you just have to impress the opposition upon the gatekeeper or at least a figure in charge, and that you have then the potential to actually have that translate into at least a rhetorical commitment to change. Now, that needs to change. We need to reinstate the primacy of institutions, of course, the State Department being one, and the State Department being led by a diplomat or at least a figure in charge who is not, or who's working on a more institutionalized basis as well. And I don't think we've seen that over the past 2 years, especially. So I think that would be at least a building block, the sort of notion that leaders in the Gulf or elsewhere in Egypt cannot simply hope that if you pick up the phone and talk to the president, you can suddenly begin to think about what you might be able to achieve just by a one-on-one conversation. We need to establish or re-establish the institutionalization of relationships. And then once that is finally in place, begin to build them out to become more multilateral, to involve not just regional partners, but to involve international organizations as well. So I think it's going to be a long process, but that critical first step has to be the ending the personalized ties, the sort of extra institutionalized relationships on WhatsApp or on sort of personal networks that we've seen over the past 4 years.
Thanks very much, Kristian. Amaney.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just say a word here just to sort of piggyback on Andrew, Maha, and what Kristian has sort of said right now is also, I think, what's going to be really important. I mean, if we're in a world that, Biden does actually win the White House, and if we're not, I would hope that somebody from the Trump administration would watch this video and think about this, but also this idea of just sort of putting some integrity back in our diplomatic processes in the region. Dispatching somebody like Jared Kushner to the region to do a lot of this shuffling back and forth between authoritarian regimes and the White House, as trying to create this aura of not only a royal court, but like personalism, familial connections, that the wheeling and dealing happens behind closed doors all the time. The average leaders, not only the diplomatic corps of like the United States, but the diplomatic corps of the region, completely been bypassed by this region. Like a complete collapse and dismissal of our public officials in the region, our public servants here in the U.S., people who sort of can diagnose the situation on the ground and to communicate back to the administration. Those communication channels are just not happening. And what's been privileged and reified here is a very sort of disturbing cycle of personalism, economic contracts at the expense of sound political processes. I mean, that's not a way to sort of run our foreign policy in the Middle East. Having Pompeo in Jerusalem during the Republican National Convention, I still question what was that all about? Are you signaling to the rest of the world that the only country that the U.S. should be invested in and care about is Israel at the expense of every other country in the region, knowing full well that a peace treaty between the Israel and the UAE or Israel and Qatar does not resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict? The core issues are still in play. Just completely ignoring that, like it's just like almost like an insult to almost every diplomatic effort or individual that has worked on this issue. The core issues on the Arab-Israeli conflict is the Palestinian issue, the territorial integrity of a future Palestinian state, the issue of Jerusalem. These issues, as much as you dispatch Jared Kushner to the region, if you don't address them, they will not be addressed. They have to be addressed. To continue to ignore this and to reify and authoritarian regimes at the expense of the core issues and sidelining our diplomatic efforts, our public servants, our foreign officers in this process. I just don't know. I'll be honest with you. I sometimes think about this and I start talking to myself, but how do you walk all of this back? That's if a Biden presidency comes to office. And if we have a Trump presidency that simply doesn't care, like where is this going? So I guess I have a question. I don't have the answers. And I want to sort of maybe punt this back to my colleagues. I just don't see how we walk this back. And how do you begin to restore even an aura of what constitutes official policy making, diplomacy making, state relations, everything we've learned in International Relations 101. Where do we start? Sorry.
Thank you very much, Amaney. And we're just up against the end of our time, so I think we'll close the discussion here. I want to apologize to those of you whose questions weren't asked. There were still other questions we didn't get to, but I also want to thank the panelists. This has been, I think, just a fantastic set of presentations and also very rich responses to the questioners, to the questions that were posed. So I've really enjoyed being, it's been an honor to be on this panel and a real privilege to be with you. So I want to thank the panelists, thank the questioners, also thank those who attended who didn't send in questions. Thank you all for joining us on this second day of the 5th annual conference of the Arab Center. There will be a video of today's event available on the Arab Center website. So, and I would also then like to strongly encourage you to register for day 3 of the conference, which will be September 30th. And so for additional information or to register, please visit arabcenterdc.org. So with that, again, thanks so much to the panelists, thanks to the Arab Center, thanks to all of you, and have a wonderful day and a terrific weekend. Bye-bye.
Thanks for including me.
Thank you.
Thank you.